Okay, let's unpack this. What happens when three elected members of Congress try to walk into a federal facility in their own district, a facility paid for with taxpayer money, and the executive branch just slams the door in their faces?
And not only that, but tells them their constitutional authority is, well, worthless in that moment.
Exactly. It leads to this high-stakes standoff that goes way beyond bureaucracy.
It really does. This wasn't just some, fight over paperwork. This was the legislative branch trying to assert its power right in the middle of massive civil unrest.
Right. So our mission today is a deep dive into that legal and political vortex that basically swallowed Minneapolis on January 10th, 2026. We're going to track the exact moment. Three Minnesota Democratic representatives, Ilhan Omar, Angie Craig, and Kelly Morrison, were physically denied access to a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility, an IC facility.
And to really get the tension, you have to understand the climate in Minneapolis at the time. This was not a routine inspection.
Not at all.
No. Just 3 days before this, the city was just rocked by the fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen, Renee Good, by an ICE agent, Jonathan Ross. The fallout from that was immediate. It was explosive.
Yeah, we're talking about a complete and total breakdown of trust. You had the federal government, specifically DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and President Trump. They came out and characterized the agent's actions as self-defense.
Right. They claimed Good tried to run the agent over. They even called it an act of domestic terrorism.
But that story was, it was immediately rejected by the local leadership.
Totally rejected. The sources show the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, he went public with some incredibly inflammatory language. He said the federal claim was false and demanded that ICE, and I'm quoting here, get the F out of Minneapolis.
Wow.
So that just instantly escalates it from a local tragedy to a full-blown war over jurisdiction.
And the federal response was just as aggressive. It created this atmosphere of fear.
And militarization, really. DHS announced what they called the largest immigration enforcement operation ever in the state. They surged a shocking 2,000 federal agents into the Minneapolis area.
2,000.
2,000. And the Whipple Federal Building, which is where this whole denial happened, that became the command center for this massive operation.
It was a pressure cooker.
It absolutely was. You had Governor Tim Walz. He was so concerned he actually mobilized the Minnesota National Guard. He was basically signaling he was ready to defend the state's position against the federal government.
So this is the exact backdrop for these three representatives trying to do their jobs.
It tells you why the visit was so urgent for them and, why the denial was so potent.
For this deep dive, we're pulling our facts from news reports, from internal notes that detail the confrontation itself, and a really crucial legal analysis from the Congressional Research Service, the CRS.
And it's critical to note, even before this denial, some political figures were already suggesting that this huge surge of agents was maybe intended to provoke more conflict.
Right. Raborum stated there was a concern the federal government was trying to, in her words, agitate people enough to maybe justify invoking the Insurrection Act.
Or even declaring martial law. So that puts the stakes of this one denied entryway way higher than just a typical bureaucratic fight.
Okay, let's get into the action of January 10th. We have Representatives Ilhan Omar, Angie Craig, and Kelly Morrison. They show up at the Whipple Federal Building.
And they're there to do what they kept calling their constitutional duty. They weren't there for a tour. They were there to inspect.
Especially given that climate. They wanted to see the conditions, see who was actually being detained inside that building.
And they did get a look, but only for a moment. The sources confirm they were allowed inside for a very short period.
And what did they see?
Repson. Omar and Morrison confirmed they observed what they called a no-bed monitoring center, and it was actively holding about 20 detainees.
20 people.
20 people under the jurisdiction of this agency that's basically occupying the city. But that look, it lasted mere moments.
Almost immediately after they get in, two officials come up and just rescind the invitation.
Just like that. They ordered the representatives to leave.
And did they say why? Who gave the order?
Rep. Omar said the officials claim the order came directly from higher-ups.
Which suggests this decision was made way up the chain, probably in Washington, D.C.
Almost certainly. And the representatives were, as you can imagine, furious. They went public immediately, saying federal law was being broken right in front of them.
And Rep. Morrison really summed up their position. She said, conducting oversight of American taxpayer-funded facilities is not only our legal right, but our constitutional duty.
And that's the core conflict right there. You have the executive branch saying, you must leave, and the legislative branch saying, the Constitution says we stay.
So, okay. The lawmakers are quoting the Constitution.
Hmm.
But DHS, the executive branch, they had their own reasons ready to go. Let's start with the first one, the procedural claim. The one that, on the surface, sounds kind of reasonable.
That was the claim from the DHS spokesperson, Tricia McLaughlin. She cited safety procedures, saying that lawmakers have to provide 7 days' notice for congressional visits.
For the safety of detainees and staff, right?
Right. And she called the surprise visit improper and out of compliance.
A 7-day notice. It sounds plausible, like a standard rule. But this is where the context is everything, because that rule was already dead.
That's exactly right. The sources are clear on this. Just the month before, in December 2025, a federal judge had already ruled that the Trump administration could not bar members of Congress from unannounced visits.
So the court had effectively struck down that exact 7-day notice requirement.
It did. The court said it violated federal law.
So they were literally standing there being blocked by a rule that a court had invalidated just weeks earlier.
Mm-hmm. It makes the procedural noncompliance excuse look like, well, like intentional obstruction. They were trying to enforce a rule they knew they shouldn't be using.
Which tells you they really did not want them in there.
It highlights that the executive branch was already fighting this exact battle in court. And it confirms that a surprise visit was the only way the representatives felt they could get a real, unvarnished look at what was happening.
Okay, so if that first justification was a legal stretch, the second one is something else entirely. It's a full-blown financial loophole.
This one is fascinating. It came from Representative Angie Craig. She reported that officials on site told her the facility's funding came from a different source. They actually called it the One Big Beautiful Bill.
The One Big Beautiful Bill. What does that even mean?
Well, it reveals a lot about how the executive branch tries to dodge oversight. See, historically, Congress is very specific. They use annual appropriations bills to fund things.
The standard budget process.
Exactly. And inside those bills, they often include very specific statutory language.
And what does that language do?
It acts as an oversight shield. It will explicitly prohibit the use of any of those funds to prevent members of Congress from conducting inspections. It's Congress writing accountability directly into the money.
So by claiming the facility was funded by this vague, big, beautiful bill, which sounds like some massive emergency spending package or something.
Precisely. They were trying to claim they were exempt from those transparency rules.
They're arguing that because the money came from a different pot, one that didn't have those standard oversight riders attached, then the rules just don't apply.
That's the argument. It's an attempt to use a technical funding mechanism to completely sidestep the legislative branch's core check on executive power.
That is a profound challenge. It basically suggests that if the executive branch can just find a different way to pay for something, they can operate outside the laws that Congress sets.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the core legal question here. What actually is the constitutional weight of congressional oversight, and why did it fail so completely on that day?
This is where that Congressional Research Service report is so helpful. The CRS confirms that Congress's power to investigate and oversee the executive branch is an implied constitutional power.
Implied. So it's not written down word for word.
Correct. It's derived from the fact that Congress needs to be able to inform itself to write good laws and to make sure the laws they do pass are being, faithfully executed.
Okay, but if Congress has this right, why couldn't these three members just demand entry and force the issue?
And that is the crucial distinction. It's what the CRS report calls the enforcement gap.
The enforcement gap.
Yes. While individual members have this implicit constitutional responsibility to conduct oversight, the power to actually enforce that right, the compulsory tools like issuing a subpoena or holding someone in contempt.
The real teeth.
The real teeth, yes. That power is typically delegated only to committees, not to individual representatives acting on their own.
So having the right is like having a key, but having the enforcement power is making sure that key actually fits the lock.
That's a perfect way to put it. The individual member has the key, the constitutional right.
Right.
But they don't have the immediate mechanism, the hammer, that a committee has.
Now, Congress has tried to fix this gap, right? Specifically for these immigration facilities.
They absolutely have. The law is very, very clear on this. Our sources confirm that since 2019, Congress has repeatedly used provisions in appropriations acts to specifically affirm the right of individual members to physically inspect DHS immigration facilities.
And those laws say, what about giving notice?
Critically, they explicitly state that prior notice is not required for the members themselves, so that statutory protection just directly nullifies the 7-day notice demand that the DHS spokesperson was making.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
The lawmakers had an implicit constitutional duty,
Yes.
an explicit federal law backing their right to access without notice,
Correct.
and a court ruling invalidating the executive branch's preferred excuse. And yet, they still couldn't get past the agents at the door.
And that brings us right back to the stark reality of that enforcement gap. If the executive branch is willing to just stand firm and refuse entry, the individual members have no immediate recourse.
They can't just call a judge and get an order right then and there.
No. They can shout, they can go to the press, they can pressure their committee chair, but they cannot instantly override that physical refusal on the ground. The executive branch used its physical presence and political will to override explicit legal mandates.
Okay, so let's synthesize this for everyone listening. What this deep dive shows is a really high-stakes, multi-layered clash. You had this immense civil unrest providing the context. Then you saw the executive branch use two specific tools to block oversight. First, a procedural rule they knew was legally defunct.
And second, that technical funding loophole, the big, beautiful bill, to claim they were just exempt from the normal rules of oversight.
And the final piece is the enforcement gap. The executive branch was able to successfully defy Congress because the individual representatives, while they had the right to be there, didn't have the immediate power to enforce that right.
Exactly. And the whole crisis atmosphere just amplified the implications. The fact that elected officials were worried this whole federal deployment was designed to manufacture a crisis, maybe to declare martial law. It shows how this wasn't just about one facility visit.
No, it was about a severe separation of powers question, where operational control just completely bulldozed constitutional checks and balances.
What's really concerning here is that this whole scenario shows just how fragile legislative checks can be when the executive branch chooses outright defiance.
So the denial of access, it really highlights that having a constitutional right to oversight doesn't really matter if you don't have the immediate power to unlock the door.
It doesn't.
Which really makes you ask yourself, how many other federal agencies might be operating outside the view of the very Congress that funds them, just because they're willing to cite a bogus rule or some funding loophole? And what are we all missing when those lights are deliberately shut off?